My first engagement with radio was back in South Africa with Radio Pulpit, which had commissioned Rosebank Bible College, where I was principal, to produce Rosebank Rendezvous, a weekly 30-minute interview of an interesting person, supplemented with some inspiring music. Most often I was the host, and to tell you the truth, programs came around far too often for me as a busy Bible college principal. One week there didn't seem to be anyone interesting in town, and I just snapped up a very indifferent college chapel speaker and interviewed them. It was deadly boring, but hey, the week's slot was occupied. It filled the airways once again. But when completed, I remember asking myself, why are we doing this? Are we just filling people's time, or is something worthwhile being achieved? Happily, we were not always as haphazard as that. One of our presenters got to interview Mother Teresa. Yes, it's the big gripe of my life that I was away that week and didn't get to do it. But I did get to interview astronaut Buzz Aldrin, who famously gave himself communion minutes before he stepped out of the Eagle lunar module to become the second person to step in the moon. So many of our interviews were inspiring and motivating, but there were also moments when we just filled our time slot. And I guess a retreat like this is a time to ask, are we just filling the airways, or are we shaping the world? The co-mission purpose statement is to impact people with experiences of God's love so that they may become more like Christ and the world more like the kingdom. We do what we do so that, impacted by God's love, people become more like Jesus and the world more like God's kingdom. Wow, that's a big task. That is not just filling the airways, and it's certainly not, can anyone think of a guest we could interview? Anyone with a pulse will do. Now, it is one thing to have a lofty purpose, quite another to have a settled sense that you mean business and are serious that you give this your very best shot. Put differently, in some ways this purpose statement is not just for the commission, it becomes part of your personal mission, your reason for being. So let's explore this seriously. Can we build a world where people are more like Jesus and the world is more like God's kingdom? What would see that transformation take place? Can we build a world with a better name? Let's start by acknowledging the critically important, captured in Zechariah 4:6, not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord. The world won't change because we click our fingers and say it should. To quote Psalm 127:1, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Let's not arrogantly delude ourselves. Only God can make people more like Jesus and the world more like the kingdom. Our responsibility is to work together with God, and our first task is to spot the fingerprints of God in the world, and it is here that our task becomes so exciting. For at a time when church attendance in Australia is in steady decline, there are two standout exceptions in an otherwise gloomy landscape. The first is the realm of Christian schooling, which is forging ahead in leaps and bounds. The second is in Christian media, radio in particular, where in the average month about 6 million Australians, almost 25% of the population, tune in and listen, at least for a while. That's an awful lot more than attend a church service. So it seems reasonable to conclude that God is doing something important in this space. And it means that those of us who have key responsibilities in this field have to seriously ask, is this the means through which God will make people more like Jesus and the world more like the kingdom? Like Queen Esther of old, it could be that CMAA has a God-ordained mission for such a time as this. How then might these changes come about? Can Christian media help build a world with a better name? How might Christian media be a path to a world more like the kingdom? Worlds are built one attitude at a time. If you want to build a better world, you must find a way to shape many attitudes. You need to know why you want to do it, and you should ask what results you're looking for. Not all changes work for good, and the history of the world alerts us to the risk of unintended consequences. How does change come about? First, you have to be able to see the change you want in order to move towards it. This is why Christian leaders who are pastors and prophets and poets are so desperately needed. Pastors, because we need a deep heart for the world. Prophets, because we need to be finely tuned to and sense what a just and flourishing world would look like. Poets, because it will take more than a little imagination to make this the most beautiful representation of God's kingdom. The question I would like to ask us as leaders of our movement of social transformation, because that is what our commission purpose statement commits us to, is what pictures of the world form as people listen to our shows or read our posts? What pictures of the world form as people listen to our shows or read our posts? In some versions of Christian radio, the portrait that arises is of a high-walled ghetto. The righteous are within and bunkering down against endless onslaughts from the enemy without. It is perhaps unintentionally a them and us world, a world where we sit in an echo chamber, where we're only ever exposed to our own views and opinions. And if challenged by this, we would reply, but why would we need any other view? When you have the truth, you have it. Curiosity is not valued, but conformity is. Mercifully, your approach to media is different. You have adopted an integrated missional approach, one that is not dualistic, where the concerns of everyday life and the music of everyday life interact together with faith, family, fun, sadness, challenge, and hope. It's all thrown together as different presenters model ways of being a follower of Jesus and the ebb and flow of life to those who peek into this world, sometimes for a few minutes, sometimes day after day. Each presenter's responses and their instinctive way of being are their own form of witness, and they open up doors of possibility to those who listen. Sometimes it becomes more active, and listeners become participants as they join hands in supporting projects or causes that would otherwise not be birthed. Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury, memorably wrote, "One of the tests of actual faith as opposed to bad religion is whether it stops you ignoring things. Faith is most fully itself and most fully life-giving when it opens your eyes and uncovers for you a world larger than you ever thought, and of course therefore a world that's a bit more alarming than you ever thought. The test of true faith is how much more it lets you see and how much it stops you denying, resisting, ignoring aspects of what is real." That's an insight that should excite all in media. Bad religion shuts things down and narrows our view of the world. But the good news of Jesus opens things up. It lets us see more and it makes us care more. We change the world by enlarging our listeners' view of the world. We help them to see a world that is and a world that could be. Some more about how change comes about. I grew up in apartheid South Africa, and the dramatic social changes that have taken place in my lifetime often occupy my thoughts. Here are some insights from what I observed of the South African journey away from the sapping damage caused by the apartheid system of discrimination. Step 1. We sensed a need for change. Much is made of the sporting tours which erupted into violence or were simply cancelled in protest against South Africa's apartheid system. In the 1971 South African rugby tour of Australia was fully caught up in that. For a sports-loving nation, those protests were significant. But I often think of a TV program that most have now forgotten, and indeed I no longer remember its name. It was a sitcom about an American high school. Most of the action took place in a classroom in which there was a poster with a boot stamping down in the words, "Stamp out apartheid." Many South Africans who watched this found it quite bewildering, asking, is this really how these lovely, funny teenagers think of us? At a time when media in the country was closely censored, this picture had slipped past, and suddenly ordinary viewers were confronted with the reality that the outside world found the apartheid system abhorrent. For many, this was a new realization, and in its own way it was very unsettling and led to a growing sense of unease with the system that was. Step 1 then, we sensed a need for change. Step 2, we saw a picture of what could be. The apartheid era in South Africa was drawing to a grisly close. Violence had become so widespread that rather than report on individual cases of politically motivated murders, the major newspapers simply showed a map of the country and inserted a number in each region. A 10 over KwaZulu-Natal meant that there had been 10 political deaths in that region in the last 24 hours. A 12 in the Eastern Cape indicated that the violence there had been even worse. There were simply too many bad news stories to tell each one. Keeping up with the statistics was the best that could be hoped for. In the midst of this early 1990s chaos, South African breweries produced an improbable series of adverts to promote their main product, Castle Lager beer. They told a story of a young black South African soccer player who had been given a chance to follow his dreams and trial for a prestigious European soccer club. But funds were needed to get him there, and he didn't have any. In a show of great solidarity with his teammates, many of them white, they put themselves out to raise the necessary funds, and in due course the money was raised. The achievement celebrated together over cold Castle Lager. It was so unlike the South Africa that was. Where were these soccer teams where people of all races worked harmoniously to help any player in need? There weren't any. The apartheid world wasn't like that at all. But as these adverts played over and over again, people started to wonder, could we ever have a world like this? It would be an enormous exaggeration to say that the Castle Lager beer adverts were the reason for the end of the apartheid era, but they did play their part. They helped people to conceive of a world that until then had been inconceivable, and so they helped to hasten its birth. Post-apartheid, South African breweries continued its strategy of visioning a world that could be. And as Bafana Bafana, the name of the South African national soccer team, entered its first Soccer World Cup in 1998, Castle launched its memorable advertising jingle, "One beer, one goal, one nation, one soul." It was more than clever. It was inspiring, a genuine force for good, and it sold lots of beer. My question today is, as media leaders, what stories are we telling? And how are they shaping the world we hope to build? Let's make no mistake about it. Stories are powerful. They speak to us in ways that careful propositions can't. We identify with them and sometimes discover roles for ourselves that we otherwise would not have arrived at. Some stories give us the courage to attempt the impossible. What if the motif behind much of our programming was, as it is in heaven? How is it in heaven? I don't know, but I imagine it as a place where God's presence is felt and where people have courage and kindness and strive for the noble and spot the good and show grace to one another. It is a world very unlike our everyday world, which is probably why Jesus told his followers to pray that God's will would be done on earth as it is in heaven. Imagine if 6 million Australians arrive at the workplace each day having heard chit-chat and banter and kindness and hopefulness that shapes the way they interact with clients and colleagues, as it is in heaven, a world more like the kingdom. It's not impossible, but we need to see that picture first. How does change come? Step 1, we sense the need for change. Step 2, we see a picture of what could be. Step 3, we paid a price. It is unusual for deep change to come about without a significant price having to be paid. There is no Christian faith without a cross. Real change is costly, and so it was in South Africa. People have often asked me what role economic sanctions played in bringing about social change, and I accurately reply that they were very significant. I remember when in the mid-1980s, General Motors closed down their South African operations in protest against apartheid. It led to mass unemployment in the Eastern Cape where I lived at the time. I remember being woken at about 4 a.m. one morning. A black man was standing at the door and he asked if he could work in my garden that day. He said he was unemployed because of General Motors' withdrawal and he was desperate to earn some money to feed his family. It was 4 a.m. in the morning, and he was already knocking at doors, desperate to get in early enough to find any work that was available. Did General Motors intend to hurt and harm that man and his family when they withdrew from South Africa? Of course not. He was one of the people they were trying to help. But they did hurt him. They hurt him very badly, even when desperate and destitute. The same story could be told over and over again. The best intentioned change often has unintended consequences, and there is almost always a price to pay. What will be the price we pay in media as we envision an as it is in heaven world? Supporters may misunderstand us. I imagine many already do. I imagine my first entry into Christian media was with Radio Pulpit. Radio Pulpit, the name says it all, exclusively for Christians. But not even for all Christians, only those Christians who enjoy being preached at from this radio station's pulpit. I don't think the founders would have understood why we today have what they would call secular music and secular stories and secular sponsors. But then they struggled to envision a non-dualistic world, a world where faith works its way out in the everyday. I imagine some of them might make some snide remarks about losing focus and faith and not being true to Jesus. And that can be very hurtful when you're actually trying to do the exact opposite. Don't sidestep the cost or pretend it doesn't exist or that every solution is obvious and simple, but have courage and pay the price. You are at the cutting edge of what God is doing in Australia at present. Do not lose heart. Poet George Herbert once wrote, "Dare to be true, nothing can need a lie. A fault which needs it most grows two thereby." One last area to think about. 6 million Australians tune into a Christian radio station each month. That's roughly 3 times as many as attend a church in any month. Many of our listeners are people who have what can be called a churchless faith. It is faith, but it is not embedded in any local church context. Or perhaps it is. It's just that it's not church as we've traditionally thought of it. It's an emerging new community, and it's online or via radio or through a podcast. When an announcer suggests a breath prayer, or when a Bible verse is read out, or when a snippet of a testimony is heard, perhaps we should imagine a 6 million strong congregation saying a heartfelt amen. Where will it lead? I don't think any of us know. But I do know that as this is one of the active spiritual frontiers in Australia at present, we must take seriously the spiritual nurture of the 6 million people entrusted to our pastoral care. It's a lofty privilege and a weighty responsibility. We have to invite our listeners to live a life worthy of their humanity, worthy of their being made in the image of the God who created them, loves them, and invites them to build a world with a better name. May God bless you with courage and creativity as you woo people to become more like Jesus and build a world more like the kingdom, a world with a better name.